You cancel plans you would have accepted without thinking 2 years ago. You sit in the middle of a conversation that should feel easy, and something in you has already left. You go to the party, stay an hour, drive home in silence, and feel more alone than you did before you arrived. And then the thought comes, the one that's been following you. Something is wrong with me. You've probably already named what's wrong. You've called it introversion. You've wondered if it's depression. You've told yourself you're becoming antisocial, that you're losing the ability to connect, that the isolation is spreading, and at some point, it will be permanent. You've tried the remedy, accepted more invitations, pushed yourself back into rooms full of people, and discovered that the remedy doesn't work. If anything, it makes it worse. Here's what you haven't considered. You might be diagnosing yourself with the wrong condition entirely. What's actually happening has nothing to do with incapacity. It has nothing to do with your ability to connect. It has everything to do with your tolerance for a specific kind of lie. The kind that social life runs on, that you used to be able to tell without noticing, and that you can no longer tell without your body registering it as a kind of violence. You didn't lose the ability to connect. You lost the ability to pretend that performance is the same thing as connection. Those are not the same loss. Irvin Yalom spent decades inside the interior lives of people who described themselves exactly the way you just recognized yourself. What he found, consistently, was that the people who reported feeling most alone were not isolated from others. They were surrounded by them. They had relationships, social calendars, people who texted back. What they lacked was something far more specific and far more rare than mere company. And the cruelest part of their suffering was that the world offered no language for it. You can't tell people you're lonely when your life, from the outside, looks full. What Yalom identified was a form of suffering that mainstream psychology barely has words for. Not loneliness as absence, but loneliness as presence. The presence of people who cannot see you. The presence of conversation that fills time, but not depth. The presence of a social world built entirely on surfaces, and the vertigo of someone who has glimpsed what lies beneath them. You're not antisocial. You've simply become honest about something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. And honesty, when it first arrives, feels like loss. What comes next is the distinction that changes everything. Because Yalom didn't just name the suffering, he mapped it. And the map reveals that there are 3 completely different forms of isolation, each requiring a completely different response. Most people never learn to tell them apart. They treat the wrong one their entire lives. And that misdiagnosis is exactly how the emptiness survives. Most people assume loneliness is a single thing. You're either alone or you're not. You either have people or you don't. Fix the quantity, fix the feeling. This is the assumption that sends you back into rooms that leave you emptier than before. Yalom identified 3 distinct forms of isolation, and they are not variations of the same experience. They are fundamentally different problems with fundamentally different causes, and treating one with the remedy for another doesn't just fail. It actively makes things worse. The first is interpersonal isolation. This is the one the culture recognizes. It's the measurable gap between you and other people. Physical distance, absence of relationships, lack of social contact. It responds, at least partially, to the obvious solutions: more contact, more presence, more people in the room. This is the one that gets talked about in articles, the one that public health campaigns address, the one that loneliness researchers count. It is real, but it is probably not what's destroying you. The second is intrapersonal isolation, the fracturing that happens inside. This is what occurs when you've cut yourself off from parts of your own experience, when there are feelings you won't feel, desires you've exiled, versions of yourself you've locked in rooms and stopped visiting. You can be surrounded by people who love you and still suffer this. It has nothing to do with who's in the room. It has everything to do with who you've allowed yourself to be. The third is existential isolation, and this is the one Yalom considered the deepest, the one that underlies the other two, the one that no relationship can ever fully resolve, the one that most people spend their entire lives fleeing without knowing its name. It is the recognition that no matter how close you get to another human being, a gap remains that cannot be crossed. You were thrown into existence alone. You will face death alone. And in the most fundamental sense, your experience of being alive is yours and yours alone, untransferable, unreachable, sealed inside the walls of a self that no one else can fully enter. This is not pessimism. This is the ground condition of human life. And here is where the misdiagnosis becomes devastating. When a person suffering from existential isolation tries to treat it with interpersonal solutions, more socializing, more connection, more time with people, the gap doesn't close. It becomes more visible. Every shallow interaction throws the real distance into sharper relief. Every performance of closeness that isn't closeness reminds you, viscerally, of what's actually missing. You don't leave social situations feeling empty because you're broken. You leave feeling empty because something in you has become precise enough to register the difference between contact and connection. And contact, it turns out, is almost all that most social situations offer. That precision is not a pathology. It is a form of psychological maturity that the culture has no framework for rewarding. The culture rewards those who can move through surfaces without noticing. Those who notice, who can no longer not notice, get handed a diagnosis, a self-help book, a suggestion to push through the discomfort. But the discomfort is not the problem. The discomfort is information. What that information is pointing toward, what genuine connection actually requires, and why it is so much rarer than anyone admits, is exactly where we're going next. Because Yalom didn't stop at naming the void. He described, with uncomfortable precision, what it would take to fill it, and the answer is not what you've been told. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Everyone believes they know what connection is. They've felt it, or felt something they called it. A good conversation, a night that ran long, a friendship that survived distance. Connection, in the popular imagination, is warmth, familiarity, the comfort of being known by someone who keeps showing up. Yalom, drawing on Martin Buber and Erich Fromm, would say that most of what people call connection is something else entirely. Something more comfortable, more manageable, and fundamentally less real. Buber drew a line between two modes of relating. In the first, what he called I-it, you encounter another person the way you encounter a tool, not out of cruelty, not even out of indifference, simply because you are relating to what they provide rather than to who they are. The conversation partner who validates your worldview, the friend whose presence reassures you that you are likable, the relationship that functions so well precisely because neither of you has ever fully shown up in it. Most social life runs entirely on this mode. It is not malicious. It is simply not connection. The second mode, I-thou, is something different in kind, not just in degree. It is the moment when the performance stops and two people are actually present to each other, not to what each provides, not to the image each is carefully maintaining, to each other as they actually are. Buber was honest about how rarely this occurs. He called it a momentary event, not a sustained state. Something that flashes into existence and then recedes. Something that cannot be manufactured or maintained by effort alone. Fromm pushed the same argument further. He insisted that love, real love, not the deficient version that most people practice, is not a feeling that happens to you. It is an act. It requires knowledge of the other, genuine knowledge, which means surrendering your need for the other to be a certain way. It requires care that is not transactional, care that does not keep score, does not demand reciprocity, does not secretly ask, "What does this relationship do for me?" And it requires what he called respect, the ability to see another person as they actually are, not as you need them to be. These are not romantic ideals. They are precise and demanding criteria. And when you hold them up against the average social interaction, the dinner party, the work friendship, the relationship held together by habit and mutual utility, the gap is not small. Here is what this means for you specifically. If you have ever experienced even a single moment of genuine eye contact, a conversation where the performance stopped, where you said something true and were actually met by it, where you felt seen not by a version of yourself you'd prepared, but by something closer to the real thing, then you have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. Once your nervous system knows the difference between contact and connection, it begins to register the gap between them with increasing accuracy. What used to feel like enough no longer registers as connection at all. It registers as its absence. This is not you becoming difficult. This is not your standards becoming unreasonable. This is the consequence of having been, even briefly, in the presence of something real, and your organism refusing to accept the counterfeit as equivalent. The question that follows is not how to lower your sensitivity back down to a manageable level. That door is closed. The question is what you do with a self that has become this honest. A self that will no longer perform, that cannot return to the surfaces, but that still needs, as all selves do, to be met. That question begins with understanding what the constant exposure to substitutes actually does to you. And it is more specific than you think. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a version of this story where you push through, where you accept the invitations, re-enter the rooms, remind yourself that connection requires effort and that you can't expect depth from every interaction, where you tell yourself you're being too selective, too demanding, too inside your own head. And so you go, and you try, and something in you, quietly, keeps not working the way it's supposed to. Yalom drew a distinction that explains exactly why. He identified two fundamentally different modes of relating, what he called deficiency-motivated love and growth-motivated love. In the first mode, you enter relationships from a place of lack. You need something from the other person: validation, reassurance, the relief of not being alone. And the relationship is quietly organized around the delivery of that need. In the second mode, you enter from a place of relative wholeness. You relate not because you need the other to complete something in you, but because genuine curiosity about another person has its own pull, its own gravity. Most social life operates almost entirely in the first mode, and this is not a moral failing. It is the predictable consequence of living inside existential isolation without ever having named it. When you don't understand what you're actually hungry for, you reach for whatever is closest. The problem is what repeated exposure to deficiency-based connection does to someone who has developed the sensitivity you've developed. Every interaction organized around surfaces and mutual utility sends a signal, not loud enough to name, but constant enough to accumulate. The signal is, you are not here. The real you is not what this exchange requires, and the body keeps score, not metaphorically, literally. The exhaustion you feel after social situations that should, by any external measure, have been fine. That exhaustion is the cost of maintaining a performance your nervous system no longer believes in. This is why pushing through doesn't work. You're not building tolerance, you're building debt. The practice this demands is simple and uncomfortable in equal measure. For 1 week, notice, without judgment, without trying to change anything, which of your interactions leave you more present afterward, and which leave you less. not which were objectively successful, not which produced warmth or laughter or the appearance of closeness. Which ones left you feeling more like yourself, and which ones required you to be someone slightly other than yourself in order to function within them. You don't need to act on the data immediately. You just need to let it exist without explaining it away. What you'll find, almost certainly, is that the interactions organized around who you actually are, even when they're brief, even when they're imperfect, cost you almost nothing, and the ones organized around who the situation requires you to be cost you something you can't fully afford, repeated indefinitely. Maslow, whom Yalom invoked in this context, observed that growth-motivated individuals are less dependent on their environment for affirmation. They are governed less by what others need them to be, and more by what their own inner nature demands. This is not arrogance. It is the natural outcome of a self that has stopped organizing itself entirely around external approval. You are somewhere in the middle of that transition. That is why this particular form of pain is so disorienting. You have outgrown one mode of relating but have not yet built the conditions for the other. What you're living through is not regression. It is the gap between two versions of yourself. What fills that gap is not more socializing. It is not more effort directed at the surfaces. It is something closer to what your withdrawal has been quietly insisting on all along. A more honest account of what your isolation is actually telling you. That accounting begins now. You have probably framed your withdrawal as failure, as evidence of something contracting in you, some capacity diminishing, some version of yourself you are slowly losing access to. The story you've been telling is one of decline, social skills atrophying, relationships thinning, the radius of your life quietly shrinking. And because the culture has no flattering narrative for someone who stops showing up, you've borrowed its judgment and turned it inward. Yalom's clinical work suggests a different reading entirely. What he found, consistently, was that patients who described feeling most alone in social situations were not failing at connection. They were succeeding at something the culture doesn't reward: precision. They had developed, through accumulated experience, an increasingly accurate ability to distinguish between what genuinely met them and what merely simulated meeting them. And that precision, once developed, cannot be suspended by willpower or social pressure. It operates below the level of decision. This is not a small thing. Most people never develop it. They move through their entire social lives unable to feel the difference between a conversation that touched something real and one that only appeared to. They leave every interaction with roughly the same reading: fine, good, nice enough, because their instrument isn't calibrated finely enough to register the gap. You have lost the ability to not register it. That is not a defect. That is information. The withdrawal, then, is not yourself collapsing. It is yourself refusing. And there is a significant difference between those two things. Collapse is passive, something happening to you. Refusal is active, something in you holding a standard that the available environment has stopped meeting. Your nervous system is not broken, it is loyal. Loyal to a quality of presence it has encountered, even briefly, and will not accept substitutes for. Yalom wrote about patients who reported feeling more alone surrounded by people than they did in actual solitude. For a long time, this was treated as paradox, evidence of some social dysfunction to be corrected. What Yalom understood was that it was neither paradox nor dysfunction. It was accurate perception. Solitude, at minimum, is honest. It does not pretend to be something it isn't. A room full of people performing connection while delivering none is a more aggressive form of isolation, because it holds out the promise of what you need while systematically withholding it. Your withdrawal is the organism choosing honest solitude over dishonest company. That is not antisocial behavior. That is integrity operating below the level of conscious choice. What this reframe demands of you is not comfort. It demands something harder. That you stop pathologizing the part of you that refuses, and start listening to what it's refusing on behalf of. Because that part of you is not arbitrary. It is not punishing you. It is holding, with considerable precision, a picture of what you actually need, and declining, on your behalf, everything that falls short of it. The question that follows is not how to make yourself need less. You cannot need less. The question is whether you can learn to tolerate the refusal without turning it into a verdict on your worth, and whether you can remain open enough, despite the accumulated disappointment, to recognize the real thing when it appears. But before that opening becomes possible, there is one more trap to name. Because the most common response to this kind of loneliness is not withdrawal. It is the opposite, a desperate reaching toward fusion, toward dissolving the self into another person or a group, because the weight of individual separateness becomes too much to carry alone. And that reaching, Yalom found, is where the most damage is done. When the weight of isolation becomes unbearable, the mind looks for the fastest available exit. And the fastest exit is not connection, it is merger. The fantasy of dissolving the boundary between yourself and another person so completely that the loneliness simply ceases to exist, absorbed into something larger, something shared, something that feels, for a moment, like it has solved the problem of being a separate self. You recognize this, maybe not by that name, but by its texture. It is the relationship you threw yourself into so completely that you stopped knowing what you wanted outside of it. The friendship that became a kind of identity. The group, political, spiritual, professional, whose belonging felt so relieving that you gradually outsourced your judgment to its consensus. The person you needed to talk to every day, not because the conversations were nourishing, but because the silence between them was unbearable. Yalom called this fusion, and he was precise about what drives it. Not love, not genuine desire for the other, but terror. The terror of existential isolation, of being a self with no guarantee that any other self will ever fully reach you, becomes so acute that the individual abandons the project of selfhood altogether. If I dissolve, there is no isolated self left to suffer the isolation. It works. For a while, it works completely. The anxiety drops. The loneliness lifts. The self that was too heavy to carry alone gets distributed across a relationship, a group, an identity shared with others. This is why fusion is so seductive and so persistent, because the relief it offers is immediate and real, even if what produces it is not. What Yalom found, however, was that fusion doesn't resolve existential isolation. It suppresses it. The underlying condition remains intact, waiting. And fused relationships carry a specific structural problem. They require the self to remain small. You cannot fully develop as an individual inside a relationship organized around the terror of separateness, because growth, by definition, differentiates you. It makes you more distinctly yourself. And a more distinctly individual self is a more exposed self, a self that can be more precisely lost, which is exactly what the fusion was designed to prevent. This is the mechanism behind relationships that punish one partner for changing, behind groups that enforce conformity, not through explicit rules, but through the social cost of dissent, behind the dynamic where becoming more yourself somehow reads as a betrayal of the connection. The relationship was never organized around two people growing. It was organized around two people not having to face their separateness. Growth threatens the contract. Fromm saw this with the same clarity. He drew the line between mature love, which presupposes and protects the individuality of both people, and immature love, which requires one or both people to remain incomplete in order to need the other. Immature love says, "I need you because I love you." Mature love says, "I love you because I need you." No, he reversed it. Immature love fuses need and love into a single desperate knot. Mature love keeps them distinct. Here is the diagnostic question Yalom's work implies, and it is worth sitting with rather than answering quickly. In which of your relationships are you fully present as yourself, and in which are you performing a version of yourself calibrated to keep the relationship stable? Not which relationships are good or bad. Which ones require you to be smaller than you are in order to survive them? The answer to that question is not an instruction to leave. It is a map of where you have been trading selfhood for the relief of not being alone, and therefore a map of where genuine connection has never actually been possible. What remains, once fusion is no longer available as an escape, is the thing Yalom considered both the most frightening and the most necessary: the capacity to be alone without being destroyed by it. Because that capacity, the ability to hold your own separateness without panic, is not the opposite of connection. It turns out to be the only ground on which real connection can occur. There is no solution to existential isolation. Yalom was unambiguous about this, and it is worth letting that land without immediately softening it. You will not find the right person, build the right community, or develop the right practice that closes the gap at the center of being. The gap is structural. It is what it means to be a self. And any approach to connection built on the fantasy of closing it permanently will eventually collapse under the weight of what it cannot deliver. This is not the conclusion that defeats you. It is the one that finally frees you. Because the moment you stop trying to solve existential isolation, something shifts in how you relate to it. It moves from being an emergency to being a condition. And conditions can be inhabited. They can even, with time, be inhabited with a kind of dignity that panic never allows. Yalom described something he called learning to rest in your loneliness, not to eliminate it, not to perform your way around it, but to develop the capacity to be with it without being consumed by it. This is not resignation. It is the opposite of resignation. It is the hardest form of psychological work available, because it requires you to stop outsourcing the unbearable parts of existence to other people and begin carrying them yourself. Not alone in the defeated sense, alone in the sovereign sense. And here is what Yalom found on the other side of that capacity. The people who could tolerate their own isolation, who had stopped running from it into fusion, into performance, into the numbing motion of a social life built on surfaces, were the same people capable of genuine connection, not because they needed it less, because they could finally enter it without desperation, without the silent demand that the other person resolve something the other person was never equipped to resolve, without the invisible weight of a terror they'd been carrying into every room. Desperation is the enemy of connection, not because it is unattractive, though it often is, but because it reorganizes every relationship around a need that the relationship cannot meet. The person who enters connection from desperation is not really present to the other. They are present to their own hunger. And hunger, however understandable, cannot see clearly. The withdrawal you've been living through, the refusal, the silence, the cancelled plans, the rooms you've stopped entering, was not the problem. It was the pressure that needed to build before something honest could emerge. You were not contracting, you were clarifying. And clarification, when it finally arrives, looks nothing like what you expected. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like resolution. It feels like a quieter kind of readiness. What this asks of you now is precise. Not a new social strategy. Not a commitment to vulnerability as a concept. One thing: stop treating your capacity for solitude as evidence of damage, and start treating it as the ground from which something real becomes possible. The self that can be alone, that can sit with the full weight of its own separateness and not shatter, is the same self that can meet another person without needing them to be anything other than what they are. That is what Yalom meant by need-free love. Not love without need, but love that does not weaponize its need against the beloved. You are not antisocial. You are not broken. You are not losing your ability to connect. You have simply arrived at the place where connection becomes possible for the first time, because you have stopped being willing to accept anything less. If this video named something you've been carrying without words for it, leave a comment with one sentence. I choose to stop pretending. That's it. No explanation needed. Just mark the moment. And if you're not done yet, if something in you knows there's still more to understand, click the video on your screen right now and keep watching.